This is my audience for my speech. My name is Bryce Moquin. I'm going to be doing my speech over John Paul Jones, why he's a founding father, and his contributions to the American Revolution. During this speech, I'm going to cover his early life, his childhood, what he did before the war. Then I'm going to move on to his major contributions during the war. And I'm going to wrap it up with what he did after the war and his legacy after death. So, to give you guys a little background about John Paul Jones, he's not considered to be a traditional founding father by any means, like Samuel Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton. He was never a member of any political office, never signed the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, never present for any of those big signings, wasn't a member of the Continental Congress. That's why he's considered to not be a traditional founding father. His contributions to the founding of America came more on the combat side. He led a lot of battles, a lot of victories, and really was considered the father of the American Navy. So John Paul Jones was born July 6th, 1747 in Kirkbean, Scotland. This is a picture of his childhood home. Most of his early years were spent at a private school, but he was often seen sneaking down to the docks to talk to sailors and watching the ships come into port. This is where it is believed that his love for the sea began. And around the age of 13, he accepted an apprenticeship as a ship's boy with a man named John Younger, who was a Scottish merchant shipper. This took him to the Americas, where he learned to trade, learned to sail, learned to do all that stuff. He was a ship's boy, so his job was not very fun. He had to do a lot of cleaning, a lot of mopping, and all that fun stuff. But his brother had moved to the Americas a couple years prior, so he moved in with his brother after his apprenticeship in Virginia, where his brother was a tailor, so he worked as an assistant, tailor's assistant for his brother. Around the age of 17, he moved back to Scotland and he got involved in the slave trade. John hated working in the slave trade. He thought it was an abominable practice. He thought it was horrible. He thought slavery was horrible. He hated it. He just needed the money, and he was good at sailing. This is a picture of a slave ship. But in a weird, kind of twisted way, the slave trade actually ended up helping him a lot. It's where he got a first captain a ship and a little stroke of luck. So on their way back from a routine trip to Africa, on their way back to Scotland, the captain and the second in command both fell ill and died. And John Paul Jones was the only one that was able to sail the ship back. So when he got back, he was made a captain. The company made him a captain that owned the ship, and he did a couple more trips back and forth. But his tactics and how he ran his ship was very harsh for the crew. And if you were against him in any way, he'd give you a harsh punishment. If you messed up, he'd give you a harsh punishment. Anyone that threatened to overthrow him was immediately thrown off the ship, executed. So his harsh practices actually he found himself on trial for murder in Scotland. So he fled to Virginia, moved back in with his brother, and this is where he learned about the American Revolution, and he really began to sympathize with the American cause in Virginia. Obviously, being from Scotland, he did not like the British Empire. And when he learned that the Continental Navy was looking for experienced sailors, he rushed to Philadelphia to offer up his services and made a second lieutenant and given command of a ship. So John spent the first 2 years of the war in the West Indies, where he had much success. At this point in American history, the Continental Navy was horrible. They had no new ships, just small converted ships. They were heavily outgunned and outclassed by the mighty British Navy. So John had to use superior tactics and sailing to win many of his battles in the West Indies. In June 1777, John was given command of the newly built Ranger. This is his first raids on the British Isles, where he sailed to the British Isles, where he carried out several raids and sunk British ships. He operated out of the port of Brest in France and became a household name for his brave exploits in the Atlantic. John was heavily disrupting the British supply lines, attacking commerce ships in and around the Isles. Back in the colonies in France, John was becoming a very popular people who inspired people during the war. Very popular person. He then returned to the Americas, where he was given command of a new ship. Then John was sent back to the British. So during his second campaign in the British Isles, he partook in one of the most famous battles of the entire Revolutionary War, which the battle with the HMS Sherpies. On September 23rd, 1779, Jones, commanding the USS Richard, engaged with the more formidable HMS Sherpies. Despite the fact of facing overwhelming odds, he was heavily outnumbered. He managed to beat it. He positioned his ship in a way where he could ram the HMS Sherpies, sinking his own ship. His crew boarded that ship, took control of it, which is crazy. He displayed great skill and determination. And this is the battle that really just sent his popularity through the roof. It was a great inspiration that the Continental Navy could really fight back against the British, even being heavily outclassed and outgunned. But little story here. During the fight, the flag, they obviously couldn't fly a British flag after they took the ship, and their American flag had burned. Obviously, you can see because he set his own ship aflame and rammed into the HMS Sherpies, and sinking his own ship and taking over it. So a Dutch woman helped them come up with one of the first renditions of the American flag, which is pretty cool. It's obviously not the flag we use today, but it's still pretty cool. Because if you didn't have a flag back then, you were considered a pirate, which is a big no. Because when they sailed back to their French port, they would have been arrested for being pirates. So they didn't have a flag. So after this battle, his health started to decline a little bit, so he headed back to the Americas to become a naval instructor. So during the later parts of the war, he just helped train up. He just helped train naval officers, naval sailors. But after the war, his health began to decline rapidly. He moved to Paris, France, where he was a brief naval admiral for the Russians. He fought like pirates and stuff out there in the North Sea, but his health was rapidly declining at this point, so he moved back to Paris. He lived in Paris for a couple years before sadly passing away. He was found dead in his apartment, and he was buried in a cemetery in Paris for about 100 years until about 1921, where the Americans wanted his grave, and they sent people over to get him, and they brought him back, and he's now buried in the Annapolis Naval Academy. And that's my speech.